What happens when a beloved television actor sits down for what should be a friendly morning chat, only to face a host whose questions cross every line of decency? It only took one dismissive comment about his late wife for the entire studio to witness a total collapse of professional courtesy that no one saw coming. Neil Dudgeon arrived at the studio that morning, expecting the usual warmth. The Midsummer Murders star had been on the show before, multiple times in fact, always greeted with smiles and light conversation about his work on the beloved detective series. He knew the routine. Walk in, exchange pleasantries with the makeup team, go over the talking points with a producer, sit down, have a nice chat, promote the new project, shake hands, and leave. Simple, professional, pleasant. But today, something was different. From the moment he walked onto that set, there was a tension in the air that even the studio audience could feel. The usual pre-show chatter seemed muted. The production assistants avoided making eye contact, and Lorraine herself barely acknowledged him when he took his seat, offering only a curt nod instead of her trademark warm greeting. Neil tried to push the unease aside. Perhaps she was having a bad day. Perhaps there had been some technical difficulty before he arrived. Whatever it was, he told himself, they were professionals. This would be fine. Lorraine Kelly sat in her chair, flanked by her regular panelists. To her left was entertainment correspondent Sarah Chen, a young journalist known for asking pointed questions. To her right sat veteran broadcaster Marcus Webb, who had been with the show for years and usually played the role of comic relief. The lighting was perfect, the cameras ready, and Neil settled into his seat with a polite smile. "So, Neil," Lorraine began, not even waiting for the pleasantries to finish, "let's talk about why you're really here today. Your new project. Another detective show, is it? Because heaven knows we don't have enough of those." The audience laughed nervously. Neil's smile faltered slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Well, actually, it's quite different from Midsummer. This is a psychological thriller that explores the mind of someone who has experienced profound loss and how that shapes their perception of justice. It's much darker, more introspective, really quite different in tone and execution." Right, Lorraine interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "But isn't it just another middle-aged man solving crimes? I mean, how many of these can you do before it becomes, well, a bit sad, a bit desperate even?" The word desperate hung in the air like a slap. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Sarah Chen glanced at Marcus Webb, her eyes widening slightly. This wasn't the usual tone for a morning chat show. This was something else entirely. Neil straightened in his chair, trying to maintain his pleasant demeanor. "I wouldn't call it sad or desperate, Lorraine. It's my profession. It's what I love doing. And I think audiences appreciate good storytelling, regardless of the genre." "Your profession," Lorraine repeated, leaning forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Tell me, Neil, do you ever feel like you're just playing the same character over and over? I mean, to those of us watching, it all looks rather samey. Detective here, detective there. Always the same stern expression, the same mannerisms." "That's quite reductive," Neil replied, his voice calm but firm. "Each role I take on has different nuances, different emotional depths. Just because they're both in the crime genre doesn't mean they're identical. That would be like saying all romantic comedies are the same, or all dramas are interchangeable." "But aren't they, though?" Lorraine said with a smirk. "I mean, let's be honest here, Neil. You've found your niche. You've found what works. And you're milking it for all it's worth. Nothing wrong with that, I suppose. But let's not pretend it's some great artistic journey." The audience was now completely silent. A few people exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading. Marcus Webb tried to lighten the mood, clearing his throat. "I think what Lorraine means is that you've become so synonymous with Midsummer, so beloved in that role, that it must be challenging to break out of that mold. Right, Neil? To show audiences a different side?" "Thank you, Marcus. But I can speak for myself, Lorraine snapped, not even looking at her panelist. The sharpness in her voice made Marcus physically recoil. She turned back to Neil, her expression hardening further. What I mean is, aren't you worried that you've become a bit of a one-trick pony? Typecast, as they say? Limited? Neil's jaw tightened. I don't think 15 years of successful television work constitutes being a one-trick pony, but everyone's entitled to their opinion. 15 years, Lorraine said with a laugh that sounded more like a scoff. 15 years of wandering around fictional villages, looking concerned. Must be exhausting. Sarah Chen interjected, clearly trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Neil, I think what's really interesting about your new project, what really sets it apart, is the emotional core. The script I read was deeply moving. Can you tell us about what drew you to this particular character? What made you say yes to this role? I'd love to, Neil said, grateful for the redirect. He took a breath, visibly trying to reset the tone. The character, Daniel, has recently lost his wife to a long illness, and he's trying to navigate a world that suddenly feels alien to him. Everything he thought he knew, every routine, every assumption about his life has been shattered. There's a depth of grief there, a raw authenticity in the writing that I found really compelling. It's not just about solving a crime. It's about a man trying to find meaning in a world that no longer makes sense to him. Lorraine's expression changed instantly, something dark flickering across her face. Oh, here we go. Another actor talking about getting in touch with dark emotions. It's always the same, isn't it? You all act like you've discovered some deep well of human suffering when really you're just reading lines someone else wrote. Tell me, Neil, have you actually experienced real loss, genuine loss, or are you just pretending you know what it feels like? Because there's a big difference, isn't there? The studio went silent. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze. Sarah Chen's mouth actually dropped open. I'm sorry, Neil said quietly, his voice tight. Well, it's a fair question, isn't it? Lorraine continued, seemingly oblivious to the atmosphere she'd created. You actors, you're always going on about method this and emotional preparation that, but most of you live quite comfortable, sheltered lives. So, have you actually lost anyone, or is this all just make-believe? Neil's hands gripped the arms of his chair. I don't think that's an appropriate question, Lorraine. Why not? You're sitting here telling us about playing a grieving widower. Surely you can tell us whether you've got any real experience to draw from? Marcus Webb leaned forward. Lorraine, maybe we should move on to talking about the rest of the cast, or... Marcus, please. Lorraine cut him off again. I'm conducting an interview here. Neil, I'm waiting for an answer. Neil took a deep breath. My personal life is not up for discussion. What I will say is that every actor brings their own experiences and empathy to a role. That's what acting is. That's a very diplomatic non-answer, Lorraine said, her voice dripping with condescension. But this is morning television, Neil. We don't do diplomatic here. We do honest. So let me ask you again. Have you experienced the kind of loss your character has? And let me tell you again, Neil replied, his voice rising slightly. That's not an appropriate line of questioning. Oh, come on, Lorraine laughed. Don't be so precious. If you can't handle a simple question about your personal life, how do you handle actual difficult roles? Sarah Chen tried again. I think what Neil is saying is that there are boundaries. Sarah, darling, I've been doing this for decades, Lorraine interrupted. I know where the boundaries are, and I'm nowhere near them. Neil's a public figure. He puts himself out there. He doesn't get to pick and choose what questions he answers. Actually, I do, Neil said firmly. That's exactly what I get to do. Lorraine leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. How very Hollywood of you. You know what I think? I think you're afraid to admit that you don't actually have any real emotional depth to draw from. That you're just a technician, going through the motions. That's enough, Neil said, his voice low but forceful. Is it, though? Lorraine pressed. Because I'm looking at you right now, and I'm not seeing someone who's genuinely offended. I'm seeing someone who's performing offense. And that's rather proving my point, isn't it? Marcus Webb actually stood up. Lorraine, this is getting out of hand. Sit down, Marcus, Lorraine commanded without looking at him. Neil and I are just having an honest conversation. Isn't that right, Neil? We're just being honest? What you're being is cruel, Neil said quietly. And for no reason that I can understand. Cruel? Lorraine's voice rose. Cruel is lying to your audience. Cruel is pretending to have depth when you're actually quite shallow. I'm just asking the questions that everyone watching at home is thinking. No, Sarah Chen said firmly, speaking up despite Lorraine's glare. No, they're not. Gee, this is uncomfortable for everyone. Well, maybe television needs to be uncomfortable sometimes, Lorraine shot back. Maybe we're all too used to these softball interviews, where we just let celebrities waltz in, promote their projects, and waltz back out without ever saying anything real. There's a difference between asking challenging questions and being disrespectful, Neil said, his composure starting to crack. And you've firmly crossed into the latter. Have I? Lorraine said, leaning forward again. Or have I just touched a nerve? Hit a little too close to home? Maybe there's something you're not telling us, Neil. Some real loss that you're too afraid to talk about, because it would actually make you seem human, instead of just another actor playing pretend. The gasp from the audience was audible. So Sarah Chen actually put her head in her hands. Marcus Webb looked like he wanted to intervene, but didn't know how. Neil stood up slowly, deliberately removing his microphone. I lost my wife 3 years ago, he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. She died after a long illness. And not that it's any of your business, Lorraine, but yes, I draw from that pain every single day, both in my work and in my life. The fact that you would weaponize something like that you would try to force me to expose that grief for your entertainment, tells me everything I need to know about who you are as a person. The studio was completely silent. Even Lorraine seemed momentarily stunned, her mouth opening slightly as if to say something, but she recovered quickly, and too quickly for someone who had just heard something so devastating. Well, there we go, she said, her voice icy, completely lacking any trace of remorse or compassion. Was that so hard? See, now we're getting somewhere real. Now we're actually having a conversation worth having. No, Neil said, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly running through him, despite the way his hands were shaking. We're not getting anywhere. Because this isn't real. This isn't a conversation. This is exploitation. This is you forcing me to expose my pain, my private grief. For what? For ratings? For shock value? And I won't be part of it. I refuse to be part of it. Oh, don't be so dramatic, Lorraine said, rolling her eyes in an exaggerated gesture that felt almost cartoonish in its cruelty. You're an actor. Drama is literally your job. This is what you do for a living. You pretend to have feelings for money. Neil's face went pale, then flushed with anger. My job is to tell stories that matter, he replied, his voice rising now, the careful control starting to slip. Not to be prodded and poked like some sort of curiosity in your circus. You knew about my wife. I can see it in your face. I can see it in the way you're not surprised. You knew, and you pushed anyway, deliberately, cruelly, because you thought it would make good television. Everything makes good television if you commit to it, Lorraine said with a shrug. And yes, I did my research. That's what professionals do, Neil. We prepare. Preparing is one thing, Neil said, his voice rising. Ambushing someone with their personal tragedy is something else entirely. Sarah Chen finally spoke up forcefully. This is wrong, Lorraine. This whole thing is wrong. Neil came here in good faith, and you've turned it into some sort of psychological ambush. Oh, please, Lorraine said, waving her hand dismissively. You're all being so sensitive. This is television. This is what people want to see. Real emotion, real conflict. Not just some boring chat about a new show that no one's going to watch anyway. That's it, Neil said, pulling his microphone pack from his belt. I'm done. I came here to talk about my work, to be respectful, to engage in a professional conversation. But you've made it clear that none of those things matter to you. What matters is creating drama at any cost, even if that cost is someone else's dignity. Oh, sit down, Lorraine said, irritation creeping into her voice. You're not going anywhere. We have 6 more minutes of airtime to fill. Then fill it with someone else, Neil said, placing his microphone on the chair, because I won't sit here and let you use my grief as entertainment. You signed a contract, Lorraine said, her voice hardening, taking on an edge that felt almost threatening. You agreed to be here for the full segment. 20 minutes. That was the deal. You don't just get to walk away because you don't like the questions. Sue me, Neil replied simply, his voice calm, but his posture rigid with barely contained fury. Maybe I will, Lorraine shot back. Maybe I'll sue you for breach of contract. Maybe I'll make sure everyone in this industry knows that Neil Dudgeon is unprofessional, unreliable, and can't handle a simple interview. Marcus Webb stood up again, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Lorraine, let him go. This has gone too far. Way too far. I've worked with you for 5 years, and I've never seen you act like this. Marcus, if you don't sit down right now, you can leave with him, Lorraine snapped, her eyes flashing with anger. I mean it. Sit down, or get out. Maybe I will, Marcus said, surprising everyone, because I don't want to be associated with whatever this is. Fine, Lorraine said, her face flushing with anger, her hands gripping the desk in front of her so tightly her knuckles went white. Both of you can leave. Just walk out. Abandon the show. Abandon your responsibilities. Sarah, I hope you're planning on staying at least. Tell me you have more professionalism than these two. Sarah Chen looked torn, her eyes moving between Neil, Marcus, and Lorraine, in clearly struggling with what to do. I think Neil deserves an apology. A genuine, sincere apology. What you did was wrong, Lorraine. An apology? Lorraine's voice rose to a near shout, echoing through the studio. For what? For doing my job? For asking the questions that needed to be asked? For trying to have an actual conversation instead of the usual softball nonsense? For being cruel, Sarah said quietly, but firmly. For forgetting that there's a person sitting across from you. Not just a guest to be interrogated. Not just content to be consumed. A real person with real feelings and real pain. I cannot believe what I'm hearing, Lorraine said, looking around at the three of them, with something like betrayal in her eyes. You're all acting like I've committed some cardinal sin. I asked direct questions. I pushed for honesty. That's what journalists do. That's what makes for compelling television. Journalists have empathy, Neil said. Journalists know when to push and when to show basic human decency. You have neither. Get out, Lorraine said suddenly, pointing toward the exit. Get out of my studio. I was already leaving, Neil replied calmly. But thank you for making it official. And don't think you'll work in British television again after this stunt, Lorraine added, her voice venomous, each word deliberate and cutting. I have connections, Neil. Serious connections. I've been in this industry longer than you. Longer than most people working today. One word from me, one phone call, and doors start closing. Producers stop returning calls. Scripts get sent to other actors. That's how this works. Is that a threat? Neil asked, stopping in his tracks, turning back to face her fully. Are you actually threatening my career on live television? It's a promise, Lorraine said, her eyes cold and hard. You don't walk out on Lorraine Kelly and get away with it. Nobody does. Ask around. Ask anyone in this building. They'll tell you. There it is, Marcus said, shaking his head slowly, his voice filled with disgust. There's the real Lorraine. Not the warm, friendly face we show the audience every morning. Not the cheerful host with the Scottish charm. But the person who thinks she's so powerful, so untouchable, that she can destroy someone's career because they wouldn't let her exploit their trauma for entertainment. Marcus, you're fired, Lorraine said flatly, her voice devoid of emotion now, cold and clinical. Effective immediately. Clear out your desk after the show. You can't fire me on air, Marcus replied, with a bitter laugh that held no humor. That's not how this works. That's not how employment law works. You can't just say someone's fired and make it so. Watch me, Lorraine said, her voice low and dangerous. Security, please escort these two gentlemen from the building. Now. I want them off this property immediately. But no security came. The crew members looked at each other uncomfortably, shifting in their positions behind cameras and monitors, clearly unsure what to do. Some looked down at their feet. Others exchanged worried glances. This was live television, broadcast to millions of homes across the country, and the situation was spiraling completely out of control in real time. No one seemed to know what the protocol was for this kind of meltdown. This is insane, Sarah said, standing up now too, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Lorraine, you need to stop. Right now. We're on air. Millions of people are watching this. Watching you threaten people. Watching you try to destroy careers. Watching you completely lose control. This isn't journalism. This isn't entertainment. This is just cruelty. Good, Lorraine said, her voice sharp and defiant. Then millions of people will see what happens when guests forget who's in charge. When they forget that this is my show. Mine. I built this. I made this what it is. And if Neil Dudgeon thinks he can come here, refuse to answer questions, play the victim, and then walk out like some sort of prima donna without consequences, he's got another think coming. I refuse to answer one question, Neil said, his voice calm despite the chaos swirling around him, despite the raised voices and the palpable tension. One question about my dead wife. That's it. Everything else you're describing, all of this drama, all of this conflict, that's your own escalation. That's you choosing to turn this into a spectacle. Don't you dare try to make me the villain here, Lorraine said, her voice shaking with rage. You came on my show. You agreed to promote your little project, and when things got slightly challenging, you couldn't handle it. Slightly challenging? Neil repeated incredulously, his composure finally cracking completely, his voice rising with righteous anger. You deliberately tried to humiliate me. You baited me. You set traps. You tried to force me to expose my most painful personal loss on live television, knowing full well how devastating it was, how recent it still feels. That's not challenging. That's not good journalism. That's sadistic. That's taking pleasure in someone else's pain. It's good television, Lorraine insisted, her chin lifted defiantly, her eyes bright with something that looked almost like triumph. No, Sarah said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. It's not. It's cruel. It's unnecessary. It's everything that's wrong with modern media. And I think I need to leave too. I can't be part of this anymore. Lorraine's face went pale, then red, the color rising from her neck to her cheeks. Sarah, if you walk off this set, if you abandon me right now during a live broadcast, you're done. Not just with this show, but with any show I have influence over. And trust me, darling, that's a lot of shows. I know everyone who matters in this industry. Then I'm done, Sarah said simply, her hands steady as she reached up to remove her own microphone, her movements deliberate and calm. Because I'd rather have my integrity intact than work for someone who treats people like this. I'd rather be unemployed than complicit. The audience began to murmur, some calling out support for Neil and the panelists, others looking simply shocked at what they were witnessing. This was supposed to be a light morning chat show, a place for easy conversation and promotion. Instead, it had become a battleground. Fine, Lorraine said, her voice ice cold. All of you, leave. I'll finish this show by myself, because that's what professionals do. We carry on. No matter what. No, Neil said, turning back one more time. Professionals know when they've made a mistake. Professionals apologize when they've hurt someone. Professionals don't threaten people's careers because their ego got bruised. You're not being professional, Lorraine. You're being petty and vindictive, and everyone watching knows it. Get out, Lorraine repeated, her voice barely above a whisper now, all the fury compressed into those two words. Neil walked toward the exit, Marcus and Sarah following close behind, their footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet studio. As they reached the edge of the set, just before the darkness beyond the lights, Neil turned back one final time. He looked not at Lorraine, but directly into the main camera, speaking to the audience at home, into the millions of people who had just witnessed this entire ugly spectacle. I came here today excited to share something I care about, he said, his voice clear and steady, despite everything, despite the emotion still visible in his eyes. I came here with respect for this show, for its history, for its audience, and for everyone who works so hard behind the scenes to make it what it is. I came here as I've come before, expecting a professional conversation between colleagues. I'm sorry that you all had to witness this. I'm sorry that what should have been a pleasant conversation about art and storytelling turned into something ugly, something painful. But I'm not sorry for leaving. Because knowing when to walk away from toxicity, knowing when to protect yourself from people who would weaponize your grief for entertainment, that isn't weakness. That's self-respect. That's dignity. And I hope that anyone watching who has ever felt pressured to expose their pain, to perform their trauma for others, knows that you have every right to say no. You have every right to walk away. And with that, he left, the studio doors closing behind him with a heavy finality as Marcus and Sarah followed. Lorraine sat alone at her desk, the two empty chairs beside her, and the vacant guest seat across from her, painting a stark picture of what had just transpired. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, some with tears in their eyes, others simply staring in disbelief at what they had witnessed. Lorraine turned to the camera, and for just a moment, her carefully constructed mask slipped completely. There was something in her eyes that looked almost like panic, a flash of recognition that perhaps she had pushed too far, that perhaps this moment would define her in ways she hadn't anticipated, in ways she couldn't control. But then the mask was back, slipping into place like armor, and she smiled that practiced smile that had graced television screens for decades. "Well," she said, her voice artificially bright, "that was certainly unexpected. When we come back after the break, we'll be talking about the latest celebrity fashion trends and taking your calls. Don't go anywhere." But the damage was done. The cameras kept rolling for another few seconds before cutting to commercial, capturing Lorraine's smile fading, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for her water glass. The crew members looked at each other, clearly processing what had just happened. The audience began talking among themselves, some visibly upset, others pulling out their phones, no doubt already sharing what they'd witnessed on social media. In that moment, as the studio lights seemed somehow harsher and the air somehow colder, it became clear that this was more than just a heated exchange. This was a turning point, a moment when the mask of morning television politeness had been ripped away to reveal something much darker underneath. Neil Dudgeon had walked into that studio as a guest. He had left with his dignity intact. The same could not be said for everyone who remained.